our next speaker of the morning, we have another very special lady. Please welcome Edwina Sands.
Good morning. Can you hear me all right? Clear as a bell, I hope. Well, it's lovely to be here for another conference. Each one I come to seems to be even better than the last. Now we have Kevin Ruane here, who's written this very, very good book, Churchill and the Bomb. So one of my grandfather's best quotations, and there are so many to choose from, is this one. The farther backward we can look, the farther forward you are likely to see. We think, most of us, that history is past, done and dusted, over with, just a memory. But history has a way of coming back to bite us. As Ronald Reagan said, "Here we go again." I remember when the Cold War was over, but then it wasn't. I remember farther back when people were scared of the A-bomb, and then, worse, of the H-bomb. And now today, the specter of nuclear war has once again reared its ugly head. Kevin Ruane is Professor of Modern History at Canterbury Christ Church University in the United Kingdom. He has written quite a few books, one on Vietnam, and one is coming out shortly, very shortly, on Anthony Eden. And that will be a very interesting one for me, because he had such a long history with Grandpapa. He is working on now something that I'm really, really longing to get my hands on, but it's not in physical form yet. It's a book on Graham Greene, and it's going to be called Graham Greene in Love and War. So there's a lot to be said. I think that it's going to show how fact and fiction is hard to separate. And we get a bit of that today here. Nobody thought that was funny. Okay. Anyway, Kevin's book, Churchill and the Bomb, in War and Cold War, is timely today. It covers, amongst other things, the close relationship with Lord Cherwell, Grandpapa and Lord Cherwell, the Prof. I knew him slightly, like I was a fly on the wall, because he was often at Chartwell. But he wasn't, he didn't relate, he didn't relate much to the children, or the children didn't relate much to him. We had a much more fun time with Monty, Field Marshal Montgomery, who would play croquet and took a real interest in people. Anyway, the Prof was an important person for Grandpapa, because Grandpapa could bat ideas back and forth with him on science, and it wasn't in the House of Commons. He could just try to work out his own ideas and what he felt and understood. So the Prof was a very important person, and that's one of the things that I've been interested in this book. So now I give you the wonderful Kevin Ruane, who will tell us some things about his book.
Thank you, Edwina. That was, is this mic okay? It's just, okay. Thank you, Edwina. Very generous introduction. And it's great to be back again. So thank you to Michael Bishop and the ICS, the whole family, for giving me this platform now 2 years in a row. It's a great honor. Now, I thought I'd begin by saying a little bit about how I came to write this book, how I came to Churchill and the bomb. It's a big man, big subject. Churchill, the nuclear statesman. Well, it really began about 5 years ago when I was asked to do some work by the Churchill Archive. That's to say, the online digital repository of all Churchill's, or virtually all of Churchill's papers, which you've heard about from Lawrence, amongst others, already in the conference. I'm told close to 1 million individual images. So letters as a homesick boarder in Harrow to his mother, all the way through World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and so on and so forth. Now, the archive is a joint venture between Churchill College, or the Churchill Archive Centre, where the original material is, and Bloomsbury Publishers. Now, I have to tell you that this archive is one of the great jewels in the crown of this digital age. And although it is subscription only for universities and other what I call grown-up organisations, thanks to the spectacular generosity of Lawrence Geller, it is, as has been pointed out already at this conference, it's absolutely free to school kids in the USA, the UK, and other places around the world. And Lawrence deserves, I think, a round of applause for that, frankly. There's not many fantastic things around that are totally free these days, it seems, but this is, if you are school kids, one of them. Anyway, I was asked to do a web essay on Churchill and nuclear weapons to illustrate the Aladdin's cave of riches that is this online archive. And in doing the original research, I came across a Churchill that I only dimly knew existed. This was a Churchill of fantastic scientific imagination and scientific vision. A Churchill who, as a teenager, was devouring science fiction, particularly the work of H.G. Wells. Now, the time machine, or rather, before I give the quote, I'm no Gary Oldman. I think the Oscar is safe, I hope, after that magnificent performance. But Churchill's speech pattern was so idiosyncratically his own. I can't quote Churchill without trying a little Churchillian rumble. So if you'll permit me that, if you'll allow me that. The Time Machine, 1895, Churchill said, was one of the books I would like to take with me to purgatory. And in 1931, he went on to say that he had read all of H.G. Wells' output with such closeness that I could take an examination in them. Beyond this, I discovered a Churchill of striking scientific vision, who in the interwar years was regularly publishing on what you call popular scientific themes in mass circulation newspapers like the News of the World and other magazines. Now, from this interwar Churchill science writing, two things emerge. Firstly, Churchill recognized that scientific and technological progress was going to be ongoing. It was going to be revolutionary. It was probably going to be a force for good. It was a new enlightenment, and it was going to bring betterment to the masses. He saw the positive side. But at the same time, Churchill also worried that mankind might not be mature enough to deal with the gifts that science was about to bestow, and that science might actually have its dark side. And one of those potentially dark gifts, or double-edged sword gifts, was something called nuclear energy. The 20s and the 30s see modern nuclear physics come of age, with newspapers carrying loads of stories about the potentialities if the power of nature could be harnessed. Potentialities of a constructive kind, cheap electricity, if you could get at this thing called atomic energy, but also newspapers carrying stories about the potentiality of something else. Maybe atomic weapons. I'd like to give you a couple of examples of the kind of things that Churchill was writing in the interwar period. He is inspired by H.G. Wells, and as Edwina said, he is mentored by Frederick Lindemann, Professor of Experimental Philosophy at Oxford University, physics to you and I. Churchill got to know the Prof, as he was almost universally known, in the early 1920s, and it's a very, very close friendship, but also scientific mentoring relationship. This piece, 1924, ominously entitled, "Shall We Commit Suicide?" In this article, Churchill writes as follows. He suggests that the poison gas of the First World War might be the first chapter of a terrible book of destructive science. Then there are explosives. Has science turned its last page on them? Might not a bomb, no bigger than an orange, be found in time to possess a secret power, to destroy a whole block of buildings, nay, to concentrate the force of 1,000 tons of cordite and blast a township at a stroke? 1924. What about this from December 1931? It appeared in the bumper Christmas edition of Strand magazine. It's a pretty well-known piece called 50 Years Hence. Many of you may be familiar with it. He says this, he says, "Nuclear energy is incomparably greater than the molecular energy which we use today. The coal a man can get in a day can easily do 500 times as much work as the man himself. Nuclear energy is at least 1,000,000 times more powerful still. There is no question among scientists that this gigantic source of energy exists. What is lacking is the match to set the bonfire alight. The scientists are looking for this, the match." You know, within a year, that's 1932, two Cambridge scientists, the Englishman John Cockcroft, the Irishman Ernest Walton, have split the atom. And at Liverpool University, another English scientist, James Chadwick, has shown that the neutron can penetrate the power chambers of the atom, the nucleus of the atom, where most of its mass and most of its energy and power resides. 1932, the match has been found. 1933, January, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. 6 years on, January 1939, two German scientists working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, they prove in their laboratory experimentally that something called nuclear fission is realizable. In other words, a nuclear chain reaction using their heavy element, uranium. They've done it on a teeny laboratory scale. But all around the world, 1939, as Europe slips closer to the abyss, all around the world, physicists corroborate their findings. And it is agreed that if this could be done, nuclear fission on a large enough scale, you would have the most tremendous power source. Cheap electricity for everybody. But by the same token, nuclear fission could also make for a superlative weapon of mass destruction. What a year to discover that, 1939. I'd like to share with you one more piece of interwar Churchill pop science, I suppose you'd call it. Mass Effects on Modern Life. It was written in 1925, but it received a much bigger audience when it appeared in this very famous collection, Thoughts and Adventures, in the early 30s. Now, in this, Churchill gave us the following prediction. He said that it might be that the military leader of some future world agony could extinguish London or Paris, Tokyo or San Francisco by pressing a button or by putting his initials neatly at the bottom of a piece of foolscap. That's 1925. 20 years on the 2nd of July 1945, as wartime Prime Minister, Churchill gave his approval. He put his initials neatly on the bottom of a piece of foolscap. He gave his approval to a request from the US government that he agree with them to use the atomic bomb against Japan. In so doing, Churchill didn't just eerily live out his own premonition. He ensured that the bombs that would ultimately hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki bore a British as well as an American seal of approval. More on that later. Let me go back to today's theme. In expanding that small web essay into a book-length treatment, I discovered the nuclear Churchill, the nuclear statesman. And rather like splitting atoms or splitting the nuclei of atoms, Churchill's career as a nuclear statesman splits into 3 chronological phases. And if I may, I'd like to run through those now. The first phase, it's the wartime phase. The first phase is what I call the atomic bomb maker phase. Let me take you back in time to 1941, more precisely to the 30th of August 1941. Churchill is, 15 months into his wartime premiership. His country remains in the coils of a desperate struggle for survival. On that day, on the 30th of August 1941, his love of science fiction, his love of the appliance of science to warfare, his belief in innovation and technology, all come together along with the urgent promptings of the man in the bowler hat, the bebowlered Prof. Lindemann, his nuclear mentor. They all come together on that day to produce Churchill's approval for a top-secret British effort to develop an atomic bomb. It's codenamed Tube Alloys. I think we can all guess if we don't know what the great spur is. The great spur is the thought, is a dread thought, that Nazi scientists could put one of these things in Hitler's hands. This was a race that simply had to be won. December 1941, of course, the United States enters the war. By late 1942, this pioneering British atomic project becomes subsumed in the juggernaut, the leviathan, the monster that is the US Manhattan Project. And from that point onwards, the United States drives this atomic bomb project, but the British are still there, as junior partners maybe, but they are still there. And so we come to July 1945. Out in the wilds of New Mexico, the world enters the nuclear age, when a plutonium device is successfully tested to spectacular effect. July 1945. The test is codenamed Trinity. Now, by then, of course, Hitler is dead, the Third Reich is a smouldering ruin, and the war in Europe is over. It turns out, by the way, that the race, although won by the Allies, it turned out that the Nazi atomic program was nowhere near as advanced as at one time feared, but nonetheless. But out in the distant reaches of the Pacific, in Asia and the Pacific, the war with Japan grinds on and on and on. And so, to come full circle, on the 2nd of July 1945, Winston Churchill, as I've already said, gave a British green light to a request from the US government to the use of the bomb against Japan. He gave that approval in keeping with the mutual consent clause of a secret atomic agreement that he had signed with President Franklin D. Roosevelt at Quebec in August 1943, the mutual consent clause. Just over 3 weeks later, that's the 2nd of July, Winston Churchill isn't Prime Minister anymore. He's lost the general election. Attlee and Labour are in. Not too long after that, of course, we have the Atomic Endgame. On the 6th of August 1945, Little Boy, the code name for the uranium bomb, is dropped on Hiroshima, or it's an air blast, it's not dropped literally on. On the 9th of August 1945, Fat Man, the code name for the plutonium bomb, is used against Nagasaki. I think the results of the bombing, the impact of these two weapons of mass destruction is so well known, I really don't need to underscore it. For Churchill, the most important thing, although he's now leader of the opposition, is that on the 14th of August 1945, Japan surrenders. For Churchill, it is cause and effect. The bombs are dropped, the surrender comes within 5 days of the second atomic bombing. 8 years later, 1953-54, in the final volume of his history of the war, Churchill maintained two things, absolutely maintained two things. First, the decision to use the bomb in 1945 was a joint decision between himself and President Truman, a joint decision. The second thing he maintains, and I'm going to quote him again, is that the decision to use the bomb was never even an issue. His thinking went like this. In war, bombs get used. The Allies were at war with Japan in the summer of 1945. The atomic bombs were weapons of war. Ipso facto, you use those weapons. Moral qualms, ethical qualms were for Churchill a luxury for others to indulge in, not for one as he saw himself, who'd been tasked in 1940 with defense of country, Commonwealth, civilization. Bomb maker, phase one. The second phase of Churchill's nuclear career runs roughly from mid-1945 to 1950. And it's maybe slightly more controversial. It's what I call the would-be atomic warrior phase. Let me begin this one with VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, 8th of May, 1945. When Churchill looked at the map of Europe, as he must have done, as we know he did not like what he saw. He saw Stalin's Red Army in occupation of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Baltic states, half of Germany. There was little or no sign that Stalin was going to abide by earlier wartime agreements to allow freedom, democracy, free elections, and so forth to flourish. No sign. For Churchill, this was a staggeringly distressing and upsetting outcome to the war in Europe. Having fought the war in a sense to save the continent from the tyranny of the right, Nazism, fascism, was the tyranny of the left, Soviet communism now to prevail. It was in Eastern Europe. What about Western Europe? Well, the democracies needed to get their act together. And you know, it's here that this thing called the atomic bomb began to enter Churchill's mind. Churchill first learned of the successful test of the bomb, 16th of July, 1945, Trinity, when he was attending the final Big Three conference of the war at Potsdam. The diary of this man, I could have given you other diary or diarists, the diary of this man, Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, gives us an insight, and there are other insights that corroborate it, into Churchill's reaction to that first atomic test. Now, this is Brooke. He said, Churchill said, we now had something in our hands which would redress the balance with the Russians. And Brooke then writes in his diary, Churchill, pushing his chin out and scowling, now we could say to Stalin, if you insist on doing this or that, well, we can just blot out Moscow, and then Stalingrad, then Kiev, Kubyshev, Kharkov, Sebastopol, and now, where are the Russians? 3 days after that diary entry, that was the 23rd of July, 26th of July, Churchill isn't Prime Minister anymore. A fortnight or so later, the atomic bombs are visited upon Japan. My point is that Churchill did not have time to factor this new atomic power into his Russia policy, his Soviet policy. But we've got a good idea of his thinking. For example, on the 7th of August, that's the day after Hiroshima, he had lunch with Lord Camrose here. Camrose wrote this. He said, Churchill is of the opinion that with the manufacture of this bomb in their hands, America can dominate the world for the next 5 years. If he'd continued in office, he is of the opinion that he could have persuaded the American government to use this power to restrain the Russians. Churchill starts talking about a showdown. That's the word he uses, and he uses it repeatedly, showdown. A nuclear-themed showdown. What he means is a diplomatic head-to-head with Stalin, in which Stalin is told in so many words, pull the Red Army out of Eastern Europe, send it back to barracks, abide by wartime agreements, or else, ... A nuclear-infused showdown. For the next 5 years, until early 1950 really, this was Churchill's repeatedly, if privately expressed view to all who listen, particularly successive US ambassadors to London. Now, politicians in opposition are much freer, we all know, to express themselves than those who are actually in power. But you know, even allowing for that, even allowing for Churchill's showmanship, the consistency over 5 years, the vehemence with which he discoursed on the idea of a showdown, suggests to me some, at least, seriousness of intent. Just one example must suffice as the clock begins to run against me. November 1947, he met William Mackenzie King, his old friend, the Canadian Prime Minister, and King's diary tells us that what Churchill wanted to do was tell Stalin directly, quote, that the nations that have fought the last war for freedom have had enough of this war of nerves and intimidation. If you do not agree to pull out of Poland and Eastern Europe here and now within so many days, we will attack Moscow and your other cities and destroy them with atomic bombs from the air. We will not allow tyranny to continue. In the end, of course, the atomic menaces that Churchill had in mind, the sort of punishment of the Kremlin for not abiding by democratic principles in Eastern Europe, was never in Churchill's gift to deliver. It was, in a sense, in Harry Truman's gift here. It was in America's gift. And to Churchill's dismay, the United States in the late 1940s never got remotely close to using its atomic monopoly in the kind of threatening diplomatic manner that Churchill evidently desired. The final phase of Churchill's nuclear career begins in early 1950. I say begins. It's the beginning of a transformation, and it's extraordinary. It will see Churchill move in the space of 4 years from would-be atomic warrior to nuclear peacemaker. Extraordinary transition. It begins in 1950. Let me give you a tiny, tiny little bit of background. In August 1949, the American atomic monopoly ended when the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, nicknamed Joe 1 in the West. Here it is. Now, in the West as well, there was alarm and anxiety and fear occasioned by this Soviet atomic breakthrough. In January 1950, the United States responded. President Truman announced that the United States would forge ahead with developing the hydrogen bomb, the super, it was nicknamed, a thermonuclear weapon. I say a weapon, I mean a monstrous device, potentially what, 1,000 times as powerful, think about that, as the puny things used against Japan? This was a serious, serious weapon, if it could be made. Now, against this backdrop, there was a general election. Lady Williams mentioned it yesterday. An election in February 1950. Now, in the midst of that election, Churchill calls for an East-West summit. A summit. The first time, apparently, the word summit had been used to describe a meeting of the leaders of the great powers at the very apex of world affairs. He calls for a summit, an East-West summit, to see if relations can't be now regulated so that Cold War does not escalate into hot war with all its nuclear menaces. Now, Labour immediately accused Churchill of electioneering. He was exploiting the nuclear anxieties of voters at that point in time. And there may be something in that. But equally, he was very worried now by that Soviet bomb. He was worried as well by the fact that Soviet bombers had the range to reach Western Europe and Britain, but not North America in the early 50s. And he was aware that Britain, this small landmass with a concentrated population in maybe 10 or 12 big cities, was especially vulnerable. Well, Labour wins the 1950 election, but they don't win it by very much, and another election happens in October 1951, and this time Winston wins it. Not by much, 16-seat overall majority, I think, but the point is Winston is back again in number 10. A year on, exactly, October 1952, Britain tests its own first nuclear weapon, October 1952. Suddenly, the nuclear club has 3 members: America, Russia, and now Britain. But it is not a club of nuclear equals. A few months later, August 1953, Britain is left standing. The Soviet Union announces to the world that it now has the hydrogen bomb. It's won the thermonuclear race. It hadn't won the race. The United States had already tested a device in November 1952, but Eisenhower won't really officially confirm that till 1954. But it doesn't matter. For Churchill, this development was distressing. It chilled him to the marrow. And by the end of 1953, he can be found privately predicting that if hot war now came, and with the UK vulnerable to Soviet bombing, all we hold dear, ourselves, our families, and our treasures, will be immolated. And even if some of us temporarily survive in some deep cellar under mounds of flaming and contaminated rubble, there will be nothing left to do but to take a pill to end it all. Out of the dark, dark shadow of the hydrogen bomb in 1954 emerges Churchill, the nuclear peacemaker. Churchill, the disciple of détente, or at least Churchill now looking for peaceful coexistence between the Cold War blocs. No more did he talk of showdowns. His last campaign, again as Lady Williams stressed so eloquently yesterday, was a campaign of peace. It became his obsession. There must be a summit, because a summit was the first step to what he called chaining the nuclear monster. Sadly, it was not to be. Churchill never made it to the summit. President Eisenhower, amongst other things, was not madly keen to rush to the summit table. Stalin had died in 1953. Stalin's successors began talking the talk of peace. Eisenhower said, I want deeds of peace, not just words, before I run to the conference table. No need to rush, Winston. But that's really not what an 80-year-old Winston needed to hear, who knew the clock was running down. And the clock does run down. In April 1955, he finally steps down as Prime Minister in favour of Anthony Eden here. Churchill's summatory ambition went unfulfilled. The Cold War continued, and so therefore did the danger of hot war and nuclear war. But you know, the final great surprise of my work on this was to discover Churchill, the nuclear visionary, at the very end, really, of his political life. It would be a good 10 years before this concept really got traction, the mid-60s, mutually assured destruction. Dr. Strangelove, we all know it's a concept most related to the 1960s. You know, Winston got there first, a good 10 years earlier. And I want to close by giving you two examples of what if you forgive me, I call the madness of Winston Churchill, at least the MAD-ness of Winston Churchill. The first is from October 1953. He's nearly 79 years of age. He talks in the House of Commons about what he calls nuclear saturation. Saturation. Both sides having now lots of these weapons. He looked forward, he said, to a future when the advance of destructive weapons enables everyone to kill everybody else. Because then, nobody will want to kill anyone at all. If that's not a description of mutually assured destruction, I don't know what is. And again, you know, in his final great speech before Parliament in March 1955 on the hydrogen bomb, he left MPs with the same message. There might in the future be a nuclear balance in the world, and that might not be a bad thing. It would be a sublime irony, he admitted, but it could be that safety will be the sturdy child of terror, and survival the twin brother of annihilation. In the meantime, he closed, never flinch, never weary, never despair. And with that, he sat down after 55 years as a parliamentarian and never got up to make another major speech in the House of Commons again. What a way to go. Lord Watson has got a fine book on 2 speeches, but that speech is up there for me with any of his great speeches. Look, I'm effectively done. That for me is the nuclear statesman. You get 3 in 1. You get the bomb maker, you get that would-be early Cold War, would-be atomic warrior, and then you get the great transformation into a conviction-driven disciple of détente. It was quite a journey from his nuclear starting point to his nuclear ending point. But I have to say, I've not had as much fun, if you can have fun with a subject like this, as I did in writing that book. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you. I think I need to wait for the mic.
Hey, Kevin.
Over here.
I think maybe ladies,
Ladies first, please.
The mic's behind.
Sorry. Hi. It's, of course, rather a terrifying story about my grandfather, and gets one a bit worried, very worried. But I'm glad that it all turned out well in the end, and he ended up with peace.
I think that I described him as a nuclear learner, that in the space of 10 years, 1945 to 1955, he went across the spectrum. He had to learn like a lot of people learned. And what he learned in the end was that if you stick rigidly to dogmatic and ideological positions, and Churchill was, if nothing, an inveterate anti-communist, in the nuclear age, sticking to those positions could lead to calamity. And that is why, ultimately, by 1954, he's talking about peaceful coexistence, which was a very hard thing for him to do, because peaceful coexistence effectively meant no longer overtly trying to free Eastern Europe, trying to challenge and confront Soviet control. It was simply too dangerous, particularly for a United Kingdom within range, and at that point, he felt uniquely vulnerable. Sorry, sir, did you?
Of course. So you mentioned that the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima had a uranium base, while the bomb dropped on Nagasaki a few days later had a plutonium base.
Yep.
I've always just classified them as atomic bombs that naturally did a lot of damage, but was wondering if you could explain why they switched the type of bomb that they dropped and if one had more repercussions than the other.
I won't go heavy into the science, but initially the heavy element uranium was the thing that everybody was working on early in the war. Now, in trying to enrich uranium, it's a particular isotope called U-235. Anyway, in the process of trying to get the core of a uranium bomb, a byproduct in what we call reactors today, a byproduct was plutonium, which they were able to farm. And plutonium, as a byproduct of trying to actually make an explosive uranium core, uranium as this byproduct, plutonium as this byproduct turned out to be just as fissionable, if not even more fissionable, and therefore more explosive. The scientists were absolutely confident that the uranium bomb would work, so that wasn't even tested out in New Mexico. They were confident that the uranium bomb would work. They weren't so confident about the detonation mechanism for the plutonium bomb, and that's why the Trinity test was a plutonium test. So, without going into the science too much, plutonium was a byproduct of efforts to create a uranium bomb. They ended up with 2 versions. Does that help?
That's my question. Thank you very much.
Okay. There's a gentleman. Do we need to wait for the mic? Oh, sorry. I think that this gentleman first, and then we'll pass it down the table.
2 points you might elaborate on, and that is, number one, the Soviets obtained information to create a bomb through espionage. They didn't do the original research. Number two, somewhere along the line, the U.S. disallowed the relationship with the Brits in terms of information on further atomic energy development. Comment on those?
Well, briefly, there is no doubt that the atomic project was penetrated by Soviet agents, and the information, as I understand it, that was funneled, not least by Klaus Fuchs, to the Soviets did contribute to the Soviet bomb in 1949. So I think that that's accepted, despite the fact that General Groves, amongst others, went to elaborate efforts to try and keep this thing hermetically sealed. Your second point is that the British decide that they can no longer do a bomb project on their own. They decide that really early 1942-ish. It's too expensive. If you start building all this stuff in the UK, you're vulnerable to bombing. There are lots of reasons why merger with the United States was a good idea. The two come together in 1942, but very, very quickly the United States outstrips anything that the UK can contribute to this project, and there are interests within the Manhattan Project that don't see the need anymore to, it was called atomic interchange, with the UK. And Churchill finds that a very distressing development. It's top secret, but there are people in the know, and those around him find it rather distressing. And I mentioned the Quebec Agreement of August 1943. It takes 7 or 8 months of personal Churchill diplomacy working on FDR to actually get the British back into the partnership. But it isn't a partnership of equals. It's a partnership of sort of one dominant partner and the British there as a kind of support act. The biggest exclusion, of course, comes after the war, and with the McMahon Act, which doesn't just shut the UK out, but shuts other countries out as well. No, sir.
Be pure speculation, but would Churchill feel more comfortable with the Nixon-Kissinger détente school, or more with the Ronald Reagan peace to strength school that ultimately wound up the Cold War?
I have thought about this, because clearly you can't research this particular episode of history without having contemporary resonances in your mind. I think it depends on where along that nuclear journey you halt Churchill and say, what would he be like? I prefer, as I suspect Edwina does, the Churchill at the end, the peacemaker. And I think that if you accept that Churchill's anti-communism ran very, 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 very deep, notwithstanding his efforts to get on with Stalin, for him by 1953-54 to embrace peaceful coexistence suggests to me one of the most remarkable acts of statesmanship, that his view was you cannot remain locked into dogmatic ideological positions in this thermonuclear age, because if you do, we're going somewhere very bad, very, very soon. As for how he would manage world affairs today, nuclear affairs today, that's a very difficult one. It makes me, as a historian, a little bit uncomfortable to extrapolate. But one thing I'll just say briefly, because I suspect my time is running out, is I don't think he ever foresaw proliferation. For all his vision and scientific interest, I think he probably suspected that Britain, Russia, and America would be the only members of the nuclear club. I'm not sure he would ever have anticipated what we've currently got. And I'm not just talking about North Korea, I'm talking about the fact there's 6 or 7 other nuclear powers in the world. So I think that would have been a challenge to him. So, okay.
Thank you, Kevin. It was absolutely worth having you back here again this year. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take our final break of the conference and resume promptly at 11 o'clock.